Chapter 20. Ordeal by Trial. Evidence. On September 19th, 1934, while Charles and Anne were enjoying a pleasant and sunshine-filled day in Los Angeles, the telephone rang. It was Colonel Schwarzkopf. Police had arrested a German-born carpenter named Bruno Richard Hauptmann for the kidnapping and murder of their baby, he told Charles. He believed without a doubt Hauptmann was their man. And they now believed Hauptmann had acted alone. Charles hung up the phone. He dreaded telling Anne when they'd returned home when they'd returned from the Atlantic trip. She'd tried to stop dwelling on what they'd lost and had begun looking forward to what would come, making a home with Charles, mothering John. She'd even begun working on her book again. They'd rented an apartment in Manhattan, started accepting the occasional invitation to dinner, tried to live a normal life. Even the press furor died down. As time passed with nothing more to report about the crime, the Lindberghs fell off the front page and Anne felt as if she could breathe again. Life on the ground had begun to feel stable. Charles went outside to where she sat with her sister in the shade of a tree on the lawn, thin and listless. Elizabeth was growing weaker every day. It was the reason they'd come to Los Angeles, to spend some time with her. Charles knelt before his wife and broke the news. "Oh, God!" Anne cried when he'd finished. "It's starting again." "Yes," he replied matter-of-factly, "but they've got him at last." They flew back east the next day and took refuge at Next Day Hill. Once again their names made headlines as the frenzied press printed story after story about the suspect. The day after their return, Schwarzkopf brought Charles into his headquarters in Trenton, New Jersey, and laid out the evidence against Hauptmann. Charles examined it closely. An investigation had been done by Arthur Kohler, the country's preeminent expert on wood identification. He'd analyzed the ladder left behind on the night of the kidnapping, tracing the ponderosa pine of its rungs to the mill in South Carolina where it had been planned. A slight, unique dimple, detectable only under a microscope and made by one of the planter's blades, allowed him to follow the wood from the mill to a lumberyard in the Bronx. It was the same lumberyard where Hauptmann brought wood, and there was more. One of the ladder's side rails, made from a low-grade sapwood, matched the plank floor in Hauptmann's attic. Kohler believed Hauptmann had run out of wood when building the ladder and had sawed a piece from his attic floor. Impressed by Kohler's scientific approach, Charles found this evidence compelling. But it was the other clues gathered by police that convinced Charles of Hauptmann's guilt. Since the ransom drop 16 months earlier, the bills with which Charles had paid had been turning up in the New York area with regularity. Unfortunately, law enforcement had been unable to trace them to the person who'd originally used them. But that changed when a $10 gold certificate with a serial number matching the Lindbergh money turned up at a Manhattan bank. Someone had written a license plate number on the bill. It hadn't taken New York detectives long to trace the plate to a Bruno Richard Hauptmann of 1279 East 222nd Street in the Bronx, an address within blocks of the cemetery where the ransom had been left. Police swooped down to search Hauptmann's apartment. Not only did they find road maps of New Jersey, binoculars, and a drawing in Hauptmann's hand of the ladder, but they also discovered something written on a wall inside a closet. The words had been wiped off, but investigators still managed to make out 2974 Decatur. That was Dr. Condon's home address. Written just below it was Jafsey's phone number. Additionally, in Hauptmann's tool chest, officers found a set of carpentry tools, complete except for a quarter-inch chisel like the one left behind at the crime scene, and in Hauptmann's garage, hidden in various places, they discovered over $14,000 with serial numbers that matched the ransom money. Charles agreed with Schwarzkopf. It appeared to be an open and shut case. Still, he had to be absolutely sure. Days later, Charles pulled a hat low over his forehead, donned on a pair of lensless eyeglasses, slipped into a Bronx courthouse, and listened to Hauptmann call out, "Hey, doctor! Here, doctor! Over here!" Charles didn't have a shred of doubt. That was the voice of the man who collected the ransom. That was the man who had killed his son. The trial on January 1st, 1935, the day before the trial began, 60,000 sightseers descended on the little town of Flemington, New Jersey, population 2,700, causing backups for 10 miles in every direction. The town's 2 policemen were completely overwhelmed by the crowds who swarmed into the third floor courtroom to pose for pictures in the judge's seat. The police even had to nail down the witness chair after one souvenir hunter tried to steal it. Meanwhile, technicians strung thousands of feet of wire and cable along telegraph and telephone poles in preparation for the approximately 1 million words that would be transmitted each day during the Hauptmann trial by the more than 700 reporters covering the event. Already, the press was calling it the greatest courtroom drama in history. Radio stations and newspaper publishers sent special correspondents, gossip columnist Walter Winchell, Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Edna Ferber, renowned newspaperman Damon Runyon to the trial in hopes of capturing the poignant, the shocking, and the tragic for listeners and readers all around the world. Townspeople rented out their attics and parlors at sky-high prices, and Flemington's only hotel was booked solid for 6 weeks. The hotel restaurant, which served nearly 1,000 meals a day during the trial, added Lindy ice cream sundaes and lamb chops Jaffsy to its menu. Vendors hawked everything from the phony to the macabre ladies' lapel pins shaped like miniature ladders and forged photographs of Charles and Anne. One enterprising teenager even clipped them as locks of the dead baby's hair. At $5 an envelope, he made a fortune, although by the end of the trial he looked like a sheared sheep. Into this circus-like scene drove Charles Lindbergh on January 2nd with Schwarzkopf beside him. He parked 2 blocks from the courthouse, then walked with a sure stride and a resolute set to his jaw through the jostling, pointing, shouting crowds to the courthouse. His purpose was obvious to remind people what all this was really about, his son. The courtroom was packed. People had been lined up before dawn to get one of the 200 seats available to the public. Charles took his place behind New Jersey State Attorney General David Willence's table. Schwarzkopf sat down beside him as observers buzzed with excitement. The hero, they noted, was just a few feet away from where Hauptmann sat at the defense table, with his chin resting on his hands. Charles leaned forward in his chair and listened intently. He would be in court every day of the trial, whether his presence was needed or not. Anne did not appear until the next day. Called to the stand, she resolved not to break down. While she gave her evidence, she kept her eyes fixed on a patch of blue sky she could see through the window. She would not allow herself to look toward Hauptmann, having reminded herself not to disappoint Charles at the trial. She described the baby. The fact that he had been able to walk and talk, that his hair had been curly. Her voice quivered with when she identified the sleeper sent by the kidnapper, and the undershirt sewn by Betty Gow that had been found on the body. And she blinked back tears as she relived the night Charlie was taken. When she finished, defense attorney Edward J. Riley declined to question her. The grief of Mrs. Lindbergh, he said, requires no cross-examination. Pale, but showing no emotion, Anne stepped down from the witness stand. She would not return to court again except on the day her mother testified. Instead, she remained cloistered at Next Day Hill, refusing to read or listen to anything about the trial. Whatever she learned about it came from Charles, and he told her very little. Charles also took the stand that second day. When when Will Lentz called his name, he strode to the witness stand, also without a glance toward Hauptmann. Undertaking After taking the oath, Charles sat down, crossed his legs, and placed his elbows on the arms of the witness chair. Then consci- then consciously, convincingly, and with absolutely no emotion, he told the court about the first hours of the search, spying the ransom note on the windowsill and the evidence he'd discovered below the nursery window. At dinner time, the court adjourned. The following morning, Charles returned to the stand to describe the night the ransom money had been handed over. He had heard a voice, he testified, very clearly coming from the cemetery. "Whose voice was it, Colonel?" asked Willents. Charles turned from Willents and for the first time looked directly at the accused. That was Hauptmann's voice, he said firmly. A murmur ran through the courtroom. From the defense table, Hauptmann stared right back at Charles. His expression, reported the New York Times, was stone cold. The trial continued. The prosecution presented a good circumstantial case. Among the 78 witnesses Willents called to the stand over the next 3 weeks as Amanda's Hotchmuth, an elderly Hopewell resident who testified he'd seen Hauptmann with a ladder in his car near Lindbergh's house on the afternoon of the kidnapping. Two other neighbors also testified to seeing Hauptmann in that area. Dr. Condon, in a thundering and melodramatic voice, testified that in his opinion Hauptmann had written all the ransom notes. There was even an agent from the Department of the Treasury who had calculated Hauptmann's finances between the date the ransom was paid and the day he was arrested. According to the agent, the accused's income had increased by more than $44,000 during a time when he was unemployed. On January 24th, the prosecution rested its case. Witnesses for the defense Now it was defense's turn. Defense attorney Edward J. Riley, once a top criminal lawyer, was past his prime. Flamboyant and pompous, he was also an alcoholic, and it was commonly believed he'd taken the case because of the publicity it would bring him. In fact, he'd become Hauptmann's lawyer only after the defendant's wife, Anna, had agreed to a proposal from the Hearst newspaper organization to pay Riley's big legal fees in exchange for exclusive rights to her story. She'd been impressed by Riley's track record of getting his clients acquitted in difficult homicide cases, but she had made a terrible mistake. Riley didn't seem particularly interested in mounting much of a defense. He called motley parade of poorly prepared witnesses whose testimonies were easily discredited by Will Entz on cross examination. Among these witnesses was bootlegger Lewis Kiss, who claimed to have seen Hauptmann drinking coffee at a bakery on March 1st, the night of the kidnapping. How could Kiss be certain of the date? Asked Will Entz. Easy, Kiss replies. 1 week earlier, on Washington's birthday, he'd rushed his son to the emergency room because of a kidney ailment. Nodding, Willens handed him a calendar and pointed out that 1932 had been a leap year. Therefore, 1 week after Washington's birthday, the prosecutor explained to the court, would have been February 29th, not March 1st. Another alibi witness was August Van Henk, a Manhattan restaurant owner who testified to seeing Hauptmann at a gas station on the night of the crime. On cross-examination, Van Henk admitted he also went by the name August Wunstorff. When pressed further, he confessed that his name was actually August Marhenk, and his restaurant was in truth a speakeasy and brothel. Others who testified for the defense were Lou Harding and ex-con who'd served for assault and battery, Sam Strapone, and a psychopath who'd been committed to mental institutions 4 separate times for hallucinations, as well as once for shooting his wife in the leg. Professional witness Peter Sommer, who made his money by testifying in courtrooms for a price, and handwriting expert John Trendley, who asserted that Hauptmann did not write the ransom notes. This opinion came, he said, after poring day and night over photographs of the documents. On cross-examination, however, he admitted to the looked having just looked them over casually. So shady and disreputable were most of these witnesses that at one point Hauptmann looked over at Lloyd Fisher, one of the members of the defense team, and said in disgust, where are they getting with these witnesses? They're killing me." Hauptmann's own testimony didn't help his case either, and Riley left him largely undefended. Incredibly, of the 17 hours Hauptmann was on the stand, 11 of them were under cross-examination by Will Entz. The prosecutor's hard-hitting questions brought out the worst in the accused. His chin jutted, his eyes smoldered with anger. He broke into a nervous sweat and repeatedly wiped his face and palms with a handkerchief. Sometimes he shouted out his answers in a burst of anger. Other times he laughed sarcastically. "You're having a lot of fun with me, aren't you?" asked Will Lentz after one such incident. "No," replied Hauptmann with a sneer. "Should I cry?" "You think you are bigger than everybody, don't you?" persisted Willens. "No, but I know I am innocent," retorted Hauptmann. Verdict. Charles's 13th Charles's 30th day in court on February 12, 1935 was spent listening to the summation of the prosecution's evidence. We have shown conclusively, overwhelmingly, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Bruno Richard Hauptmann is guilty of the murder of Charles A. Lindbergh, Jr., declared Anthony Hawk, a member of the prosecution's team. Throughout Hawk's speech, Charles sat rigid and emotionless, his grief tightly bottled, but the trial was obviously taking its toll. The previous morning, he'd exploded at Anne, shouting out of shouting out months of frustration. Why did she have to cry so much? It was time to grab control of herself. He called her weak, less irretrievably broken for giving into her grief. Giving into her grief. Shouldn't her book be done by now? It would be if she'd quit letting her sorrow consume her. Then, storming from the house, he'd driven to Flemington to spend yet another day in court. Sobbing, Anne had stumbled into her mother's study and poured out her misery. Betty Morrow stroked her daughter's head and cooed soothing words. But inside, she burned with anger at her son-in-law. Charles isn't capable of understanding Anne, and the beauty of her soul and mind. Betty wrote in her diary. He would like to reform her, make her over into his own practical scientific mold. Betty longed to give him a piece of her mind, but she could not say anything. But she could say nothing. No matter how stupid he is. Anne's emotions spewed onto the pages of her own diary. I must not talk. I must not cry. I must not write. I must not think. I must not dream. I must control my mind. I must control my body. I must control my emotions. I must finish the book. I must put up an appearance, at least of calm for Charles. I must force myself to be interested in plans, in work, in John. I must eat, I must sleep. But last night, lying in bed, shrinking over into my corner, trying not to cry, or at least cry only inaudibly. Not to wake C, trying not to toss and turn, trying to be like a stone, and still rigid, heavy and still and rigid, except for my tears, except for my mind. And the mind wasn't running free. I don't dare let it. Say poetry, think clothes, don't let it run away. I felt it. I felt I could understand insanity and physical violence. I could understand anything. At 11 o'clock on the morning of February 13th, the jury retired to consider its verdict. All through the day, as the jurors remained sequestered in their guarded rooms and reporters and broadcasters spread speculative stories, tension mounted outside the courthouse. A milling crowd of thousands filled the streets. When darkness fell, the mood turned angry. Kill Hauptmann, the mob chanted. Kill Hauptmann. In his jail cell, the defendant lay face down on his cot, his hands pressed over his ears. Meanwhile, Charles, who'd driven back to Next Day Hill, that afternoon. Meanwhile, Charles, who'd driven back to Next Day Hill that afternoon, sat down to dinner with Anne, Betty, and a house guest. The famous author and diarist Harold Nicholson. Because they expected a verdict at any minute, 2 radios were turned on, one in the pantry next to the dining room, the other in the drawing room. Thus there were jokes and jazz while we ate, and one ear strained for the announcer from the courthouse, recalled Nicholson. After dinner, everyone went into the library, the radio blaring from the drawing room. Betty took out some photograph albums, and they all pretended to be interested in them. Around 10:45, the family left Nicholson alone in the library. But moments later, Betty returned. Hauptmann, she told her guest, has been condemned to death without mercy. Nicholson followed her into the drawing room where Charles and Anne stood beside the radio listening. You have heard the verdict in the most famous trial in all history, the announcer cried. Bruno Hauptmann now stands guilty of the foulest, and trembled. Turn that off, Charles, turn that off. They all went into the pantry and poured glasses of ginger beer. Charles hopped up and sat on the counter. There is no doubt Hauptmann did the thing, he said in a calm, detached way. My one dread all these years has been that they'd get hold of someone about whom I wasn't sure. I am sure about this, quite sure. It is this way. Everyone listened as he went over the case, point by point. Only once did his feelings leak into his narrative when he described Hauptmann. He was a magnificent looking man. He said, splendidly built, but his eyes were like the eyes of a wild boar, mean, shifty, small, and cruel. The next morning, Anne wrote in her diary, the trial is over. We must try to start our life again, try to build it securely. Charles and John and I.